Okay, so the title of my message today is this: Is God a misogynist? Is God a misogynist? Understanding the Bible's difficult passages concerning women. A misogynist, by the way, if you don't know, is basically just someone who strongly dislikes women. Many feminists and atheists argue that the God of the Bible is portrayed as a misogynist, someone who hates women. It is said that the Bible regards women as the mere property of men and of lesser value than men. The feminist author Karen Garst, author of the Faithless Feminist, she argues that religions like Christianity are, quote, the last cultural barrier to gender equality. Also, she says that biblical Christianity has historically participated in the, quote, subjugation and degradation of women. So she's not a fan of Christianity or the Bible. She further goes on to say that the Bible is, quote, not sacred or the inspired word of a deity because it was written by men who believed women were their property. So she believes that the Bible is not inspired by God, but was written by men in order to keep women down. The feminist writer Taslima Nasreen writes, quote, if one believes in women's rights, one first has to cast away one's religious identity. All religions are anti-women. No one can be pro-woman while supporting anti-woman dogmas. And of course, she believes that Christianity promotes anti-woman dogmas. So, the modern cultural narrative among feminist critics of Christianity is that biblical Christianity is directly opposed to women, against women, written to hold women back, written to demean women, okay? Now, this narrative is false, of course, as we'll learn. But before we get there, I want to highlight the importance of this issue. Unless you've been living under a rock for the past couple of years, then you've noticed that we're kind of in the middle of a social revolution right now, aren't we? We're in the middle of a social revolution. A couple of years ago, a famous film producer named Harvey Weinstein was exposed as a serial sexual abuser. To date, over 80 women have made allegations against him, including allegations of rape. 80 women. These allegations sparked what has come to be called the #MeToo movement, which has since been shining a bright light on how women are mistreated and abused by powerful men. When this movement erupted in light of these allegations of Harvey Weinstein, it just seemed like every other day a new scumbag It was a parade of scumbags just coming out of the woodwork, allegations coming forth about how these powerful men within media, within Hollywood, and politics have been sexually abusing women. Now, there are a couple of observations that we can make in light of all of what is happening right now. Number one, despite all of our social progress in the West, where women are the most free that they've ever been, despite all of our social progress in the West, women are still being abused. They're still being exploited, and they're still being degraded by men. This is taking place, by the way, even in places like Hollywood, as we've learned, which is supposedly run by the most enlightened and progressive among us, people who have ditched so-called archaic worldviews like Christianity and have fully embraced modern feminism. Even in those places, women are degraded, exploited, and abused. Despite all of feminism's social advancements, women are still treated as objects in this culture. they are still being exploited and abused. Dr. Katie McCoy, she puts this point really well. She says, quote, "We women can vote, own businesses, pursue any educational or vocational field, be CEOs of Fortune 500 companies, university presidents, U.S. senators, but we still have to be careful going to the grocery store at night. We still have to walk fast with our eyes forward and pray that the cat-calling men don't become aggressive. We still have to be hyper-vigilant in a parking garage. For all of the social activism of the last 60 years, rape culture, sexual harassment, and misogyny have not been educated out of society or reformed away. For all of our social progress, humanity's core still remains unchanged. And for all of our social advantages, women still face oppression and sexual abuse. That women have achieved unparalleled independence, yet still contend for basic safety and public value, is a sobering cultural commentary." End quote. What does that tell us? It tells us that the problem in our society cannot be solved by more of the same. The problem in our society cannot be solved by more of the same. In other words, the feminist movement has been utterly ineffective in helping women and bringing about true change. As Dr. Katie McCoy puts it, the core of humanity remains unchanged, despite everything that all of our social advancements, everything, women are still oppressed and mistreated. Why is that? Why is that? The reason is that we are dealing with a moral problem. We are dealing with a moral problem. And this leads to my second observation that I want to make. Our society is hungry, it's aching for justice and moral revolution. Our society, our culture is crying out for justice and moral revolution. That's right, female oppression is a moral problem. The claim that men shouldn't abuse women is a moral claim. Demanding that men, quote unquote, do better as the Me Too movement demands, that is a moral demand. Do better. Even the idea that women ought to be valued and protected from abuse is a moral value. But where do these moral values come from? These moral values assume an objective moral standard. They assume an objective moral standard, or else we can't have any moral values or duties. If there is no God, there is no objective moral standard. Think about it this way. If atheism is true and there is no God, on what basis do women or men have any objective moral worth at all? We're merely the accidental byproduct of chance, no different than any other living organism on the speck of dirt we call Earth. We're all going to be doomed in the eventual heat death of the universe. We've all evolved from the primordial goo just the same as mosquitoes and rats. If atheism is true, why should we treat women or human beings in general as special? Where do we get these delusions that we have these moral obligations toward one another, that people have intrinsic dignity and are worthy of honor and respect? After all, on the atheistic view, humans are just animals. And animals have no moral responsibility. Animals have no moral responsibility. Think about it this way. We don't sentence a hyena to prison for murder when it kills a wildebeest. We don't condemn male dolphins as rapists when they forcibly copulate with female dolphins. Why not? Because they're just being animals. They don't have a moral responsibility. So if humans are just animals too, then on what basis can we truly say that men should, quote unquote, do better? That women should be protected? Without God, we have no objective basis for saying that Harvey Weinstein and all the rest were really morally wrong. In fact, if God doesn't exist, if life came about only by natural causes, whereby the strong overpowers the weak, survival of the fittest, how can we even say that crimes like rape are morally wrong? Let me explain. There was a paper written in 2002 by two evolutionary sociobiologists by the names of Randy Thornhill and Craig Palmer. The title of their paper was "Why Men Rape." And in this paper, they conclude that rape has a quote-unquote evolutionary basis. It's not about control or domination, they say, but a sexual impulse that has evolved within men. Rape evolved as a reproductive strategy, they say. Men who were unable to get a woman another way would just take her by force. But if the impulse to sexually overpower women is the result of evolution, then within the naturalistic, atheistic worldview, it is necessary for human survival. Naturalism, therefore, gives humans no intrinsic value at all. It gives us no basis for condemning rape. Again, we're all just animals. The naturalistic, atheistic worldview gives us no imperative to protect the vulnerable in our society. So what is the secular, atheistic solution to this problem? This problem that we all agree is a problem. We all agree it's a problem, even though secularists and atheists logically have no objective basis for that moral judgment. Everyone agrees this is a problem. In their paper, Thornhill and Palmer don't explain why, according to their worldview, behavior such as rape is wrong. They just assume it. And they don't explain how concepts like right and wrong can even exist to begin with, according to their worldview. Nevertheless, their proposed solution is an education program for young boys, informing them of their evolved sexual desires. Here's what they write. They say, quote, "Most of all, the program should stress that a man's evolved sexual desires offer him no excuse whatsoever for raping a woman, and that if he understands and resists those desires, he may be able to prevent their manifestation in sexually coercive behavior." So in other words, if men understand why their brains evolved to be what they are, they might be able to stop themselves from raping. In other words, you are an animal. And if you understand that you are an animal, maybe you'll learn to live not like an animal. That's the solution. Inform men that they are a slave to their genes, and if they know that, maybe they'll be able to not be a slave anymore. Dr. Katie McCoy actually does a really great job of ripping this apart and exposing the logical flaws in this kind of thinking. Here's what she says. She says, even this suggestion implies a moral code that is incongruent with purely biological explanations for such sexually coercive behavior. If sexual assault is an adaptation, upon what moral basis would a man attempt to prevent its manifestation? Upon what moral basis could a government even penalize a man for such a crime? After all, maybe his brain made him do it. This is the logical implication of the naturalistic worldview. There is no objective basis for female dignity, no objective basis for moral behavior, no objective basis for men to do better. Without God, all we're left with is naturalism. And as we've seen, naturalism gives us no real solution. Secular feminism doesn't work. It hasn't worked. It has failed. It cannot bring about true change in society whereby women are valued and protected. So then what does work? We've already talked about what doesn't work. What does work? How do we change the world and elevate the status of women? The answer is biblical Christianity. We know that Christianity changes the world because it already has changed the world. And we'll talk more about that a little bit later. What I'd like to do now is establish a broad biblical framework on this issue. And I'm going to go kind of fast, and I'm just going to dump a bunch of information on you guys. Hopefully you'll be able to follow along and everything. But I would like to, if we have time at the end, I'd like to zero in on some of the difficult passages which appear on the surface to denigrate women in the Bible. But before we do that, I think it's important that we establish God's overall perspective as revealed in Scripture. The overall message of the Bible clearly affirms the immense value and personhood of women, which is equal to that of men. Men and women are ontologically equal and have moral worth. This perspective is clearly evident in the very beginning of the biblical story. Genesis 1:27 says, God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. So here we see that God created both men and women in his image. By the way, being created in God's image not only bestows upon humans intrinsic value and worth, but also elects them to represent God's purposes and will on earth. So right here we have a basis for dignity, intrinsic human worth of men and women, as well as purpose in our life. That is to say, both men and women are equal in dignity and vocation in God's creation and plan. Already, we have a major difference between atheism and Christianity, don't we? Human moral worth makes sense only within a theistic worldview. It doesn't work with atheism. As Dr. Richard Davidson writes concerning that verse we just read, he says the fundamental equality of man and woman is unhesitatingly proclaimed in the first chapter of the Bible, end quote. Feminism doesn't get to steal the credit for the concept that women have equal value to men. The Bible taught that concept first. In a world, by the way, that had a very low view of women, the Bible elevated women, gave them equal value to men. This raises a question, of course. If the Bible was hopelessly misogynistic, as feminists claim, why do women share the special status of bearing God's image along with men? If the Bible taught that women are inferior to men, wouldn't that be clear in the beginning? Wouldn't they have been made along with the animals for man to have dominion over? That's not what we see. Instead, Scripture teaches that women, just like men, have intrinsic value and purpose, as I explained. Women even share with men the blessing of dominion over all creation. When we look at the creation of woman, specifically Eve, we read that she was taken from Adam's side. Some translations say rib, it means side in Hebrew. Therefore, Eve is represented as Adam's other half, if you will. Man, in other words, is incomplete without woman. Man needed a partner to fulfill the divine calling of bearing God's image and ruling over creation. He couldn't do it by himself. So men and women are different. They're distinct. They have different perspectives and talents. They're created different, but they're equal in value, and they need each other to fulfill God's purposes. Men are hindered in fulfilling God's purposes without women, and women are hindered in fulfilling God's purposes without men. That's why we have the church made up of both men and women. When we look at the establishment of marriage, we see that man is to leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife. This teaches us that a man's first loyalty is not to his parents, it's not to his tribe, it's to his wife. He holds fast to her, the verse says, which, by the way, is a phrase often used to express the covenant commitment that one is to have toward God. The same strength of that covenant commitment. Marriage is a bond wherein the wife is honored, cherished, and protected. So here we have a basis for protecting our women. And sex is to be enjoyed only within those safe boundaries of a loving covenant relationship between man and wife. It's not supposed to be stolen from a woman outside of those boundaries. It can only be enjoyed within those safe boundaries where the woman feels protected, honored, and cherished. Therefore, according to the first chapters of Genesis, women aren't inferior beings or property created to be used and abused by men. No, they have intrinsic worth and are equal partners with men in the divine purpose to glorify God on earth. Even beyond Genesis 1 through 2, as Paul Copan writes, he says, there are, quote, undeniable affirmations of equality in the Old Testament from theological, historical, and legal perspectives. In the midst of this fallen, broken world and man-made societal structures, God gives man the Torah. He gives Israel the Torah. He condescends to meet humans where they are in the midst of the fallen world, gives them his law, directing them back to the creation ideal as much as possible within their context. There are hints of this creation ideal embedded all over the biblical text and all over the Torah. For example, consider the fifth commandment. It says, Exodus 20:12, honor your father and your mother. Honor your father and your mother. Now, many of us who've grown up in the church and we've heard this passage so many times, we tend to gloss over it. But think about that for a second. Father and mother are equally worthy of honor within the family. Did you know that in other cultures in ancient Israel's day, the mother was actually controlled by her son? And we see this expressed in other ancient Near Eastern law codes. Not so in the Torah. The Torah elevates women to an equal position of honor within the family alongside man. The same punishment for striking your father applies when you strike your mother. In addition, the Torah expresses the equality of men and women in regard to morality, purity, and justice. Paul Copan writes, quote, the moral and ceremonial laws of Israel presumed that women were not only equal, but also shared equal moral responsibility with the men. Deuteronomy 29 teaches that women, along with men, are full members of God's covenant community. Deuteronomy 31 teaches that women, along with men, are fully accountable to God and expected to learn and do the Torah. They weren't just to stay at home and let the men learn and do the Torah and be members of God's covenant kingdom. No, they were right alongside with men and expected to be a full acting member. Women also receive the same benefits as men in the Torah. Sabbath rest, for example, being able to participate in worship services at the temple and tabernacle during the feast days. When you get to the New Testament, it's even clearer. The creation ideal of male-female equality and female dignity is again fully affirmed. Galatians 3 teaches that men and women stand equal before the Father in regard to being justified and included among his people. In contrast to the low view of women expressed in the Greco-Roman culture surrounding the early church, followers of Messiah promoted equality and protection of women. And guess what? Guess how they did this? Guess how they promoted equality and protection for women? They did this primarily by adhering to a biblical sexual ethic. Let me explain. In the Greco-Roman world, women were truly second-class citizens. According to the scholar Nancy Pearcey, married men often engaged in extramarital affairs with, quote, girlfriends, mistresses, prostitutes, courtesans, other men, and, most of all, household slaves. It didn't matter. Men had virtually no moral limits on their sexual behavior. This forced their wives to have to, quote, compete with a host of other people for their husband's love and affection. So in opposition to this cultural double standard, Paul taught that infidelity on the part of the husband is no less severe a sin than infidelity on the part of the wife, demonstrating once again this creation ideal of equality. According to 1 Corinthians 7, a husband not only has authority over his wife's body, but a wife has authority over her husband's body. He's not allowed to just do what he wants. Christianity's sexual ethic, in addition to its extreme opposition to the practices of abortion and infanticide, which were very prevalent in that day, these were among the main reasons women in the ancient world were so drawn to the early church. In fact, one of the earliest criticisms of Christianity from the outside was that it was mocked as being a woman's religion, because women were so attracted to the values of Christianity. Why? Because those values elevated them. Ironically, today, the very values that liberated and elevated women in the ancient world are the same values that modern feminists despise and view as oppressive. In reality, it's modern feminism that is oppressive and degrading and harmful to women. The feminist ideals of abortion on demand and casual sex with no consequences, no commitment, these are harmful and degrading to women. It's going right back to ancient Greco-Roman culture. In summary, an overall picture of the treatment of women in the Bible reveals that they have immense value and are worthy of honor and protection. There is a lot more that I can say on this point. I'm actually in the process of writing a book on this, and you'd be amazed at just how much there is on this topic. But I do want to focus a little bit now on some of the difficult passages in the Bible that are often cited and brought up as examples of the Bible's low view of women, according to some. I do want to focus a little bit on that and see if we can get some clarity. The first topic that we'll bring up is polygamy, okay? It's no secret that many men in the Bible, King David, for example, and Jacob and others, they engaged in this practice of polygamy. The Torah even has regulations concerning polygamous marriages. This has led many to conclude that the Bible permits or even perhaps endorses this practice. That's what a lot of people believe, even Christians. Understandably, this is a big problem with women because the vast majority of women are not cool with the idea of sharing their husband with some other lady, and you can't blame them. Many feminist critics point to the Bible's alleged endorsement of polygamy as proof, quote unquote, that the Bible views women as property. Okay, so where do we begin in addressing this topic? Well, I have 4 points that I want to make here. Unfortunately, there is a lot that I could say about this. Unfortunately, because of time, we won't really be able to unpack everything as much as I'd like. However, you can get my book when it's finished. I actually have an entire chapter on this topic alone, and it goes through everything. But here are the 4 points that I'd like to bring out. So let me state up front that my position is that the Bible does not endorse this practice. Okay, so I want to make that clear. Now I'm going to make my case. Number 1, like homosexuality, polygamy is a clear deviation from God's original design for marriage as established in creation. Number 2, the Torah does in fact prohibit the practice of polygamy. Number 3, rather than being endorsed in the Bible, polygamy is consistently painted in a negative light and therefore discouraged in the Bible. And number 4, the passages used to say that polygamy is approved by God have been misunderstood. All right, so regarding this first point, it's pretty self-evident, right? Monogamy is God's original design for marriage. It was the first marriage in creation. Well, also, in addition to that, both Yeshua and Paul affirm monogamy by using the creation model of marriage as the basis for their own teachings on what marriage is supposed to look like. So while monogamy may not have been the focus of their teachings, it is nevertheless the assumed model in every mention of marriage throughout the New Testament. 1 Corinthians 7:2 says, quote, "Each man should have his own wife, and each woman her own husband." In 1 Timothy 3, Paul said that elders and deacons within the church are only to have one wife. And by the way, this reinforces monogamy for everyone, not just elders. Why? Because elders are to be examples of righteous living to the rest of the church. A prohibition of polygamy can also be logically deduced from Yeshua's statement in Matthew 19 that a man who divorces his wife without warrant and marries another, quote unquote, commits adultery. As the scholar Philip Siegel explains, Yeshua, quote, would not call a divorced man's remarriage adultery if he was permitted a second wife. Makes logical sense, right? Therefore, if the original marriage in creation was typological for all marriages as Yeshua and Paul understood it in their teachings, then polygamy obviously goes against God's intent for marriage. What about the second point, that the Torah does prohibit polygamy? It's commonly understood that there are no commands, direct commandments, against the practice of polygamy. Well, consider this commandment from Leviticus 18:18. It says, "You shall not marry a woman in addition to her sister as a rival while she is alive, to uncover her nakedness." Now, this verse is usually understood as prohibiting only one type of polygamous marriage. That is, a marriage to two sisters while both are alive. That's the common understanding. However, and this is going to get a little bit technical, scholars have pointed out several reasons to think this verse does not necessarily refer to two blood-related sisters, but actually to two women in general. And if that's correct, we therefore have a direct commandment forbidding polygamy in the Torah. By the way, we know that this interpretation was held by some first-century Jewish groups, such as the Qumran community. You can read the Dead Sea Scrolls, certain parts of the Dead Sea Scrolls, like the Temple Scroll. The Qumran community actually have writings where they exegete Leviticus 18:18, and they give a commentary on it, and they interpret it as a law, a full ban on polygamy in general. That's how they interpreted it, and I would argue that the apostles shared that same perspective. But why should we believe that Leviticus 18:18 prohibits all polygamy rather than simply prohibiting a marriage between a man and literal sisters? Well, first, in Hebrew, the passage says a woman in addition to her sister. In Hebrew, that is Isha el Achota, which literally means a woman to her sister. Okay? Scholars have pointed out that this is an idiomatic expression that is always used in the distributive sense of, quote, one in addition to another. For example, Exodus 26 speaks of the coupling of curtains and clasps, quote, one to another, which is literally a woman to her sister. Ezekiel 1 speaks of the wings of the cherubim touching one another, literally a woman to her sister. In Hebrew, this is Isha el Achota, which is the exact same phrase used in Leviticus 18:18. In fact, every time the phrase Isha el Achota occurs in the Tanakh, it is used in an idiomatic manner, never literally. And it's used to mean one to another. By the way, this is also the case with the masculine equivalent of the phrase, Ish el Aku, which literally means a man to his brother. So we don't have to guess what the meaning of this phrase is. Everywhere it occurs in the Bible, it's used in an idiomatic sense. Therefore, when we interpret this phrase in light of its consistent usage throughout the Bible, Leviticus 18:18 ought to be understood as saying, quote, "You shall not marry one woman in addition to another." Now, there are several additional, that's just one point. There are about 5 other reasons exegetically and other evidences that can be grammatically as well that can be demonstrated to prove this. And if you're interested, I actually wrote an article on this verse alone. It's on my website, and I could get you that information if you want it. But I wish we can go through it all right now, but we simply don't have time. So let's go ahead and move on to my third point against polygamy being endorsed in the Bible, and that is that polygamy is consistently painted in a negative light, and it's therefore discouraged rather than encouraged. So what do I mean by this? Well, in addition to these specific moral and legal statements that we find in the Torah and the New Testament, the biblical authors teach against polygamy through narrative clues. They teach against polygamy through narrative clues, revealing the disastrous consequences of the practice. Here's what Dr. Richard Davidson says. He's an Old Testament scholar. He says, in the patriarchal period, there are several biblical examples of plural marriages. Although these biblical narratives provide no explicit verbal condemnation of this practice, the narrator presents each account in such a way as to underscore a theology of disapproval. The record of these polygamous relationships bristles with discord, rivalry, heartache, and even rebellion, revealing the motivations and/or disastrous consequences that invariably accompanied such departures from God's Edenic ideal. So we know this. Just read through the entire Old Testament, right? We have Abraham and the disaster that was between Sarah and Hagar, of course, Jacob, and all of the heartache and anguish and jealousy within that situation. And of course, we have King Solomon. In 1 Kings 11, by the way, the biblical author is clear that Solomon's idolatry and eventual downfall were the direct result of his polygamy. You can't get any clearer than that. The negative consequences of polygamy throughout Israel's history is, by the way, probably the big reason the Jews all but abandoned the practice by the 1st century. You even have some sects of Judaism that we know of, at least the ones that we know of, some sects completely condemned the practice and taught that it was prohibited according to the Torah. David Instone Brewer, he's a scholar, he writes that polygamy, quote, was not widespread and it was already declining in the 1st century. He goes on to say that, quote, there was already an established feeling that polygamy was inappropriate. So within Judaism, during the 1st century, there was already this established feeling that polygamy was inappropriate. And we know that at least the Qumran community for sure outright prohibited it. And I would say that the apostles did too. The fourth point that I want to make is that the passages that allegedly approve of polygamy have been misunderstood. There are several passages. I'm only going to be able to address a couple. Again, get my book when it comes out, and I have an entire chapter addressing everything. But first, let's begin with Deuteronomy 21:15 through 17. And by the way, other scholarly resources that you can get in addition to my book, get Dr. Richard Davidson's book, Flame of Yahweh, and Dr. Gordon Hugenberger's Marriage as Covenant, and they likewise make this case against the idea that the Bible endorses polygamy. All right, so what about Deuteronomy 21:15 through 17, which details the inheritance rights within a polygamous family? That, it basically assumes that a man has 2 wives, and it's giving regulations on what is to be done with the inheritance when you have children by 2 wives. Well, many people will say that this is an endorsement of polygamy, or at least that the Torah permits polygamy. After all, it gives regulations concerning it. Well, first, it's a mistake to assume that the existence of laws that address negative situations prove that God therefore approves of the situation. Let me say that again. It's a mistake to assume that the existence of laws that address negative situations therefore prove that God approves of the situation. Think about it. There are examples for there are laws regarding restitution. If someone steals, there are laws dealing with that situation. But those laws regarding restitution don't legitimize theft, do they? Deuteronomy 23:18 forbids prostitute wages from being used as payment for vows. But the existence of this law doesn't legitimize prostitution. In the same way, the existence of a law detailing the rights of a firstborn in a less than ideal situation, that is, a polygamous family, it doesn't legitimize polygamy. God is dealing with the situation, and he's saying, you've got yourself into this mess. Here's what you do within this situation. It's not an endorsement of the situation. Okay, well, what about 2 Samuel 12? Here it says that God, he declares through Nathan that he, quote unquote, gave Saul's wives to David. People will say, see, how can God be against polygamy if he gave multiple wives to David? God himself gave David multiple wives. Well, first, why do we assume that God's giving of Saul's wives to David entails that he married him? It's a total baseless assumption that people make. There's no mention in the text at all of marriage. All this passage is saying is that Saul's entire estate has been transferred to David's care. Nothing in the text indicates marriage at all. There's a second point we can make on this. David couldn't have married Saul's wives because he'd be violating God's laws against incest. One of Saul's wives was the mother of David's wife, Michal. So are we going to say that God's giving of Saul's wives, assuming that he married them, entails that God now therefore endorses incest against his own law? Of course not. But that's the logical implication if we take that pro-polygamy perspective. Much more can be said on this issue, but hopefully we can see that contrary to the complaints of feminists and others, the Bible in no way endorses polygamy. So I'm just going to address one more difficult topic because of time. And that is another common objection that you'll hear from feminists is that the Bible sanctions rape, or that the Bible commands rape victims to marry their rapists. This is a claim that they make. And if that's true, I would admit that that would be pretty disturbing if that were true. If the Bible actually commanded rape victims to marry their rapists, what do you do with that? Well, I don't think that's what the Bible says. This objection is based on Deuteronomy 22, 28 through 29. Again, we're going to get a little bit technical here. But the objection is based on Deuteronomy 22, 28 through 29, which says that if a man, quote unquote, seizes a young virgin and has sex with her, he is to pay her father 50 shekels of silver and marry her. Now, feminists allege that this passage is clear proof that the Bible regards women as simply the property of men. They say that the female victim in this passage is sold to the rapist who violently attacked and degraded her, which is horrible, right? That's the accusation they make. So how do we address this? Well, there are several nuances in the text that we need to take note of. First, the passage in question is preceded directly by legislation that does clearly address rape. Okay? According to verses 25 through 27 of Deuteronomy 22, if a man, quote unquote, seizes, which in Hebrew that word is chazak, but if he seizes a woman in an open field, the Torah demands he be put to death. But the young woman, in this case, is presumed innocent. She's supported and believed. This passage uses a different Hebrew word for seizes than is used in verse 28, the passage in question, okay? So the verb here, chazak, according to Katie McCoy, can refer, quote, to the violent overpowering of another, and in the context of this text, clearly denotes rape. So what do we learn from this passage? Number one, we learn that the Bible regards rape as a horrific and violent act. The Bible condemns the act of rape as violent and horrific. In fact, it's directly compared to murder. Deuteronomy 22:26 says, "For this case is like that of a man attacking and murdering his neighbor." So secondly, the woman in this scenario is portrayed as a victim who is worthy of justice, not as the property of men. Oh, well, she's been violated, so sell her off. No, that's not what is portrayed here in the passage. She's portrayed as a victim who is worthy of justice. The rapist is put to death. By the way, this is unlike other ancient law codes like the Middle Assyrian laws, which actually did sanction sexual assault. They actually permitted retaliatory rape against an assailant's wife. So if someone raped another man's wife, he was allowed to have the assailant's wife raped by others. And so that's the Middle Assyrian laws. The Torah upholds the value and personhood of women. The Torah seeks to protect women. So why is this important? Why is this point important? Because when we get to verses 28 through 29 of Deuteronomy 22, they seem to be describing a completely different type of situation than what is described immediately preceding it in verses 25 through 27. While verses 25 through 27 certainly does speak of rape, verses 28 through 29 speaks of a different situation. It speaks of a young couple's consensual sexual encounter. All right, how can we prove this? Well, there's several points we can make. First, as I already mentioned, a different word is used for seizes in this passage. It's a tafas. While this word does mean to capture or to seize, unlike chazak, which is the word used immediately prior in the situation beforehand, it does not carry the same connotation of force, according to scholars. If the biblical author intended to describe rape in verses 28 through 29, it's reasonable to think he would use chazak as he does in the verses directly before it, but he doesn't. He uses a different word. Why? Because it's a different situation. In addition to not having that same connotation of force, the Hebrew word tafas also is used in non-violent metaphors to speak of things like God, quote unquote, capturing the heart, seizing the heart of Israel, like in Ezekiel 14:5. This has led some scholars to interpret the use of tafas in this passage to imply that the man, quote unquote, seizes the woman, not in a physical sense, but in an emotional sense. Now, this point is especially relevant when we consider this legislation in light of the parallel commandment, the parallel passage in Exodus 22:16 through 17. This passage in Exodus is basically, the passage in Deuteronomy is basically elaborating and reiterating this passage that we're about to read in Exodus. It says, if a man seduces a virgin who is not betrothed, did you catch that? If a man seduces a virgin who is not betrothed and lies with her, he shall give the bride price for her and make her his wife. If her father utterly refuses to give her to him, he shall pay money equal to the bride price for virgins. So, Deuteronomy 22:28 through 29 elaborates on this legislation in Exodus. And remarkably, rather than the word seizes, as is used in tafas, as is used in Deuteronomy 22, the Exodus passage uses the verb patah, which means seduces. So based on this parallel legislation, it's likely that this section in Deuteronomy does not deal with rape, but with seduction. In this scenario, the man persuades the young woman to engage in sex, and she consents. This is what Paul Copan writes. He says, even if there is some pressure from the man, the young woman is complicit. Though initially pressured or seduced, she doesn't act against her will. So it's not rape. Now, to be clear, I am not suggesting that the woman is not being mistreated in this scenario. She was being mistreated by the man. Although she did consent to sex, so it's not rape technically, the man still dishonored her by persuading her to engage in sex without first giving her the dignity of marriage. Therefore, what does the Torah do? The Torah holds the man accountable for his behavior. It requires that he marry her. It requires that he make things right, to give her a home, to give her security. Also note that the father has the right to refuse this arrangement. So in either case, the woman isn't required to marry him. So contrary to the claims of critics, the Bible does not sanction rape. It does not force rape victims to marry their rapists. In fact, as we see in verses 25 through 27, the Bible depicts rape as a horrific and violent act comparable to murder and worthy of capital punishment. And I agree with that, by the way. Female victims of rape are to be protected and cared for. When it comes to the verses 28 through 29, the law for the couple to get married is designed ultimately for her protection and security, in addition to holding the man accountable for his crimes. Men weren't allowed to just use and lose a woman. They weren't allowed to just use them for sex and throw them away. No, within a biblical worldview, sex is a meaningful thing that is shared between men and women within the boundaries and protection of a covenant relationship. So far from degrading women, this law actually upholds the dignity and personhood of women. When we take a closer look at these passages, we clearly see that God has a deep concern for the protection of women. Far from reflecting the character of some misogynistic deity who views women as inferior to men, God's laws demonstrate his love and concern. Over and over and over again, the scriptures affirm that women are worthy of honor, dignity, and protection. So in conclusion, the Bible teaches that women are valuable and should be protected. Christianity gives us a basis for the demand of the Me Too movement that men should, quote unquote, do better. Atheism doesn't give us this moral basis. Christianity does. Men have a responsibility as Christians to care and protect the vulnerable in society. As for the sickness within our culture, this sickness that degrades women, Christianity is not the problem, it's the solution. Only the Messiah and only his presence within the ministry of the church can bring about true change and moral revolution. Thank you, guys.